Hello, history students. I'm going to be discussing World War II today, but this is going to be a very incomplete presentation. There were so many moving parts, so many actors in this conflict, so much going on the home front, going on in Europe and the Pacific theater. I'm never going to be able to get to it all, so I'm going to touch on parts that I find important, but by no means all of them. The History Channel has done, I'm pretty sure, hundreds of videos on World War II, on the different battles. John Green's history is really good, discussing a lot of the causes, what was going on in Europe that caused it. So, if you're interested, I strongly recommend using these really great resources. So we're looking first at the home front. Woodrow Wilson wanted us in the League of Nations. When we signed the Treaty of Versailles, he saw that this could all come again. He knew that we needed internationalism to keep this from falling apart like it did in World War I. The problem is, and I've mentioned this in my class, that the Treaty of Versailles was not terribly well constructed. Germany was on the hook for billions of dollars, and England and France owed the United States a ton of money. So Germany was paying us. England and France were waiting for their payments from Germany to give us our money, and then we were taking that money, lending it to Germany. And my class has heard this before, but I think it bears repeating, that this Dawes plan where we'd keep loaning money, Germany would use it to pay, they would use it to pay us, in this continual cycle led us into the Great Depression, because one of those little things started to fall. Germany wasn't able to pay its debts. England and France couldn't pay its debts. We didn't have the money to loan. You see how this is going, right? So England and France said, okay, we'll lower what Germany owes us if you guys can lower or forgive our payments for World War I. America didn't like this idea, and it started cascading. We weren't part of the League of Nations. There was nobody really watching the different governments in Europe trying to find peace. In this picture, you can see we were a keystone. We could have made this League of Nations, what later became the United Nations, work. But we had been burned. We said World War I was us getting involved in the old world's problems. That's not us. We don't belong there. And so here's more political cartoons. Woodrow Wilson's floating the idea of the League of Nations. He went on this whirlwind tour trying to get the American people to buy onto it. It ended up giving him a stroke, and the last of his term wasn't very healthy. But he wanted business ties with Europe. He wanted collective security for the world. So this was a liberal democratic idea. The conservative Republicans were more nativist. They had the American first, let Europe police Europe idea. And we, of course, wanted to disarm. We didn't think that we should have such a big world presence, so we didn't need as much of a standing army. Okay, so in 1922, we had this 5-power treaty. For every 5 battleships the U.S. had, Britain could have that many battleships. Japan could only have 3. France could have a little more than 1.5 battleships. Italy 2. We were trying to make the world be less aggressive. It didn't work. As you can see, we're talking about World War II. And here are some of the war debt. Okay, moving on. Okay, and of course I discussed this billions of dollars in war debt payments from the Allies to the US. Germany owed billions to the Allies. So if you're paying on credit and you miss a paycheck, kaboom! And that's what happened. And hello, Great Depression. Luckily, we had a World War II to pull us out of it. Okay, this image, political cartoon, you know I'm fond of them. This was made in 1930, saying that that treaty, that one where Germany was taking the blame, which in fairness, it was Germany's fault World War I happened, but because of this deal, because there were so many problems with it, World War II was just a part two, a continuation of that first one, and we see Hitler and his Nazi party crawling out of this bad deal. So what was happening is, while there wasn't as much physical damage to German manufacturing, the German mark was not doing very well. Inflation got really bad, where the Germans were having to take wheelbarrows full of money to go buy their food. Also, their farming practices were bad, so it took more land to grow more food. They could have worked on that, but that's beside the point. But it was to the point where the German mark was having such an inflationary problem that the German would have to sit down when he went to lunch at the restaurant. He and the owner of the restaurant would have to negotiate prices of the food before they sat down, before the food was cooked and the person ate it, because the currency could change value and be so much worth so much less than when the man sat down for food. So people were scared. Scared people tend to act stupid. And this stupidity came when Hitler, who had been a soldier, corporal in World War I, and he had spent a lot of time in the hospital, probably needed somebody to talk to him and talk him out of it, because he was laying there blind for months, blaming the Jew. And the anti-Semitism was not new in Germany, was not new in Russia, was not new in Europe. It was there, but he was a good public speaker. He had been in the military, he had been wounded in battle, and he said he had a great idea to fix Germany's woes. And he said, I know how to fix all this problem, I know who's to blame, elect me. And that's how he crawled out of the Versailles Treaty. So many people broke, they went with the megalomaniac. Okay, at the same time that Germany was going through things there, Japan had militaristic intentions. They invaded China. The rape of Nanking is really pretty hideous. As the name implies, it's not so much hyperbole, it actually was. There was a lot of death, a lot of atrocities committed. United States had dealings in China, so we started supplying China with people to help them fight this battle, but they were also at that time fighting their own communists. And the leader in China that we were supporting spent a lot more time actually fighting his communist problems than going after the Japanese invaders. But that's a whole nother story. That's world history. You should read on it. It's interesting. Okay, and while this is going on, while Germany is becoming more and more fascist, while Italy's becoming fascist, and Spain, and of course Japan with its taking over, or trying to take over China, we're like, yeah, no, not our problem, not our deal. That's the old world's problems. We're the new world, it won't bother us. Anybody recognize the artist that drew this? So, yep, this is a Dr. Seuss piece. He was very much in favor of us intervening. He later apologized for his anti-Japanese propaganda pieces, though, because he realized the severity of that. But, as it says, forget the terrible news you've read. Your mind's at ease in an ostrich head. And let's not worry about what's going on in Europe. Of course, not everybody was involved. This picture is Ernest Hemingway. He was also a soldier in World War I. He saw that the Spanish were that their democracy was being destroyed and that there was a fascist trying to take power. So he and I think it was like 3,200 Americans illegally went over to fight in the Spanish Civil War, and they called themselves the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Spain, although fascist, like Hitler, like Mussolini, Franco said, yeah, no, we're staying out. We're going to be neutral during World War I. And he was allowed to stay in power till 1975. So I guess staying neutral was a good play on his part, but he was a pretty terrible guy too. Okay. So Hitler, remember how I said Germany's farming practices weren't so good? So they wanted more land for Germans to farm. And Hitler knew that war would be in his best interest. So what he was doing, he took the Sudetenland, and he was hoping it would actually provoke England and France to war. And Neville Chamberlain, the guy in this bottom picture next to Hitler, he's like, okay, you shouldn't have done that. That was a very bad thing to do, but pinky swear you won't take anything else, and we'll leave you have it. Yep. And Hitler, pinky swore, said, yep, I'm good. And then he invaded Poland. So this, of course, called England and France's hand, and they had to go to war, which was the right thing to do. Neville Chamberlain was no longer prime minister. Churchill took over, and he was a very strong wartime leader. Churchill had his own flaws. Look at him in the history of India and you'll see some of his flaws. He was really mean to Gandhi. But, so, Germany was doing blitzkrieg, lightning war, where they were sending in tanks, trucks, planes, blimps, and they were bombing England, and they rolled into France and took France and set in place the Vichy, sorry, I'm not pronouncing it very well, government, which was a puppet government of France ruled by Germany. In 1940, Franklin Delano Roosevelt saw where this is coming. Remember, Roosevelt was an internationalist. He thought that we should be dealing with Europe. He wasn't one of these isolationists, but the isolationists had a lot of sway in government. And the New Deal wasn't paying off as promised. People were getting tired of us still kind of being in depression. They didn't think that the New Deal was doing what it should. So a bunch of people voted for Wilkie. Of course, looking at the electoral vote, poor Wilkie didn't stand a chance, but remember in the previous election, Roosevelt got all but 2 states. So this was a slide in his popularity. Okay, but remember we're staying neutral, but our president and a lot of other people in our country were like, yeah, no, we really should be a part of this. England's our ally, we have a lot of business there, and we saw the way the winds were turning. We didn't want the fascists completely owning Europe. So we started the Lend-Lease Act, and Churchill had been sending letter after letter, kind of heartbreaking letters when you read them, like, please, we need you, America, we can't do this, I don't know how much longer we can stand. So you see how much was going to England. We were sending to Africa. We were sending to Soviet Union. And here's the actual numbers of it. Great Britain, 31 billion. Soviet Union, 11 billion. France, 3 billion, because France had already fallen. We were supporting them the best we could. There were still some troops out there, and there was the French resistance, but France had fallen. So, yes, Lend-Lease was, yep, we're neutral, we promise. We weren't neutral. We were already somewhat engaged. Japan knew if we got involved and we started fighting, that it would be bad for them. Roosevelt was trying to not do much with what was going on in the Pacific, but Japan was nervous. We controlled most of where Japan got its oil from, and Japan got its oil from us and other places that were kind of in bed with us. So, as I said, Roosevelt didn't want to mess with Japan. He had a good relationship with China, but his affiliates, the people in his cabinet, had better relationships with China. And so while Roosevelt was out of the country at talks with the other Allied powers, his lieutenants took that opportunity to freeze Japanese assets. So all the money Japan had in our banks and in American properties was frozen. And they knew they only had, I can't remember if it was somewhere between 6 months to 18 months. I can't remember the exact number, but they had very little oil reserves of their own. And they were afraid that with this, they wouldn't be able to get oil anymore. So the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor with the hopes that it would scare us into remaining neutral. Really big tactical error on their part, honestly. Yeah, kicking the Americans is never a good idea. So, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. I'll link that speech. You really should watch it, where President Roosevelt is declaring war on the Empire of Japan. And then, of course, Germany comes in with its own declaration of war against us right after. So, at first, Japan's doing really well, and it knew that if it could have a lot of really good victories up front, it had a really good chance. It knew that the U.S. would absolutely win a protracted war. We have more people, we have more resources, we have more oil, we have more of everything. So Japan wanted this to be a fast war. We didn't need a fast war. And remember all those islands we picked up during the Spanish-American War? So 1898, we got all those islands. Hooray, they paid off. We had a lot of different places to fight from. We had a lot of strategic defense area out there. And we were picking up islands. We were just, island hopping was our way of fighting this war. And the Battle of Midway was a really decisive one where Japan had been doing good, and then, okay, America's going to win this. How many people we're going to lose depends on how much further it goes. And that how long this war lasts was part of Truman's calculus in ending this war. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, so there was two fronts. So we're fighting in the European theater and the Pacific theater. And Stalin really wanted us to spend more time opening up another front that would help him and take the pressure off the Russians. Because remember, the Soviet Union is our ally. They're our buddies here. And we should have helped them a lot more than we did, but Churchill, it's like, no, we really need to keep him at arm's distance. The communists are dangerous. And so we spent more time in Africa, fighting this war in Africa with the British than in Europe helping the Russians. It's big, it's complex. There's a World War II simplified video that might give you some idea of the complexity of this. The Germans invaded Stalingrad. A lot of Germans froze to death in that battle. It didn't work for Napoleon, it definitely didn't work for the Nazis. Okay, I'm moving on because I could spend a week talking about this. So here we are fighting in Africa. Here we are going up through Italy. Then of course, well, okay, I'll talk about that in a minute. So, Americans knew about the German persecution of the Jews. They knew about Kristallnacht. They didn't know the extent of how bad it was, but they knew that the Jews were losing their property, that then they were starting to be taken away and rounded up. They didn't know exactly, but I think it was somewhere around 93% of people in the United States said that the treatment of the Jews was deplorable and Germany shouldn't be doing it. But even though the vast majority of Americans said this is bad and wrong, somewhere around 70% of Americans said, but it's not our problem, United States should not intervene. So, yeah, we could have done a lot more, we could have intervened sooner, and really awful is we refused to accept immigrants. Francis Perkins and other people in Roosevelt's cabinet were like, yes, we need to increase the number of Jews and others trying to flee Germany, because they weren't the only persecuted group. And we should open up immigration numbers to allow more, and we did a little bit, but not enough. And you know that poor child, Anne Frank, that ended up dying of epidemic typhus in the concentration camps along with her sister? She and her family were on a boat in New York Harbor. They were here for a number of days. Actually, it wasn't just New York. The pilot of that boat went around trying to find a safe place to let off the people fleeing Germany. And I think it was the Coast Guard or the Navy, I don't remember, were under orders if any of the people off that boat jumped overboard to get ashore, we were to take up arms and make sure they didn't come ashore to put them back on the boat. So yeah, we knew. Okay, sharp transition here to union membership was going up because there was a lot more jobs, because we were manufacturing stuff. We were making ships and planes and everything that was needed to fight World War II long before we were actually physically in World War II. And then once we were in, even more production ramped up. So there was a ton of government spending, rising demands for labor, union membership. And if you look at this graph, this sharp spike right here is government spending during this war. Kaboom. Government spending just kept going up though, but that's in the 2000s. Moving on. We had war production boards that told businesses what to make, how to make it. We had a whole bunch of war mobilization going on, and there was an Office of Price Administration because we were afraid of inflation. People wouldn't be able to buy, which meant the economy would suffer again. So this Office of Price Administration helped make sure that we didn't sink back into depression. Okay, there was so much tech. We had people dedicated to breaking the code. Oh, and it was so cool. There was a bunch of really eccentric people working on breaking the Japanese code, and they figured it out. And they weren't sure. They had broken it enough that they knew there was going to be an attack, but they weren't really sure where. So there was this really cool thing where they released information saying that location P or something like it, whatever the Japanese were using, so location P is suffering from a lack of water, because they thought maybe this was one of the places that they might attack, because there was a lot of, we're going to attack P in so and so time. And so the Japanese, in their coded messages to each other, said, location P is running out of water, this is a good time to attack them. And kaboom, yep, we know it. We did crack the code right. So those code breakers were really important. Okay, not everything was peaceful here on the home front. Remember how I said union membership was going up? There was still a lot of problems with African Americans not being treated as they should. A. Philip Randolph was really important decades before in the sleeping car porters strike, and now he's important again, trying to have social equity. Core, I think Congress on Racial Equality, I'm pretty sure that was what it means. People on the home front, not everybody was involved in the war. There were people trying to get equality, and A. Philip Randolph was a major player in that. Oh, more about codes. So, in World War I, we used Cherokee soldiers that spoke in a stylized, encoded Cherokee language, because nobody in Europe had any languages similar. So so after World War I, people in Europe learned some Cherokee. This time around, the Navajo were used in the same position, where they were sending information. It wasn't exactly using Navajo, because they had to use words like hummingbird for helicopter, that type of thing. But they were very important. Coded information is critical to doing well in a war. We signed deals with Mexico, getting migrant laborers to help us supply the food for the war effort. But you know the whole they took our jobs thing going on? Well, there was a lot of racial tension with the Mexicans in California and Arizona. And there was wartime rationing. Everybody supporting the war effort was using less. You use less sugar, you could only get it on certain days, you use cheaper cuts of meat, so the good stuff could go to the war effort. Well, cloth was also rationed, cotton was needed. And zoot suits were part of a style in which young men could dance better. If you look in this far left corner, you can see this long suit with the baggy pants. So yeah, it's a dancing style, and it was a style used by young Mexican Americans. Unfortunately, the zoot suits became a target. Men in zoot suits were targeted and beat up by soldiers on shore leave or at liberty, because look at you, not supporting the war effort, wasting all this material, you're killing Americans, you don't support our cause. And so they were attacking these young men and ripping their suits off, beating them up and leaving them mostly naked. So the zoot suit riots were a nasty several days. Have I mentioned there's a lot of racism in the United States? So, when we declared war against the Empire of Japan, we were afraid that the Japanese Americans living here were not loyal and they would pass on secrets and information to Japan. So we don't tend to call them concentration camps, and they were not death camps, but they were our way of taking all the Japanese people out of California. It became illegal for the Japanese to live on the West Coast, but they were also in the United States, rest of the United States, east of the Mississippi, taken off their land and put in other places too. So this was pretty horrible. Our country has since apologized and we've paid some reparations. The Japanese in California, like, you have like 3 days to sell all your property and report to these relocation centers. They didn't get money really for their businesses, and a lot of them went back having not sold, and other people were occupying their homes. Korematsu was a young man who didn't go. He changed his identity and refused to report to one of these relocation camps. He was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in jail. He lost in the local courts. He lost in the Supreme Court. Korematsu versus U.S. is like, yeah, no, sorry, national security has to come first. I'm not entirely sure this is the very worst decision of the Supreme Court. It might not be, because Plessy versus Ferguson is up there with really stupid things we've done, but it's pretty bad. But at this time, the Chinese were being treated somewhat better than they had been in the past. Not better. If you see here, there was a lot of propaganda pieces. I'm going to link to a really interesting one. It does have some racist imagery, but not as horrific as the picture that you're seeing here by war bonds so these evil people don't kill us. But it's Donald Duck fighting the war in Japan. So I'll link that in the comments. Women became a major force. There was a lot of propaganda pieces drawing women into factories. If you take these kind of jobs, more men can go fight. And so there was a lot of nurses going over to war. There was a lot of women entering factories, building airplanes and ships. Really great stuff. And this really changed the country, because those women didn't want to go back to work. Wouldn't go back home. They wanted to stay in the workforce. But this was a concerted effort at this time to draw women into the workforce. Once again, Roosevelt does well, but not overwhelmingly so. Still good in the electoral votes. So, D-Day was interesting. We invaded Normandy, France, and we were coming in through France. We were coming up through Italy. The Russians were coming in from the east, coming into Germany that way. So this was the beginning of the end. The Allies came and were a huge, powerful force. It could have been another location, and Germany had actually gotten fake messages, and they expected us to land at a different location, so we kind of caught them a little bit off guard with this one too. But it was still fierce, ridiculous fighting. If you see the first little bit of Saving Private Ryan, gives you an idea. It's pretty gruesome. Okay, here's a map of the Allied counteroffensive as we come up through Italy and France and come east from Russia, or come from the east to the west from Russia. And this sets up the Cold War. Of all the repercussions coming out of this, if we had treated Stalin better, if we had listened to him, if we had worked more closely with him, and he trusted us, we might not have had the Cold War. But Germany was divided about where everybody stopped. So if you look at what became East Germany, that's as far as the Russians got. And then they divided it up there. War in the Pacific Theater was a naval war. Very interesting, taking island by island by island. And we won in Europe. We were still going in the Pacific. And Roosevelt died. And Truman was left with this decision. He had access to the greatest, most destructive weapon ever created. Because Germany and England and us were all trying to create this nuclear weapon, the atom bomb. And we got it first. And Truman was told, you can have this weapon, it's ready to use, but it'll kill hundreds of thousands of civilians. But if we let this war go, how many American lives would we lose? And he was stuck alone with the decision to kill hundreds of thousands of now, or even more hundreds of thousands over a longer period of time. I don't know how any of us would respond to that. Okay, that's one of the amphibious ships used at the invasion of Normandy. They were packed on and then they ran off through the water. Interesting footage, you should watch it. So yeah, Oppenheimer was our chief scientist in charge of this Manhattan Project, which wasn't actually done in Manhattan, but that's a whole other story. Remember, codes and all. We were testing in New Mexico. We first bombed Hiroshima, and we were going to pick a more cultural target, but it's like, no, this is sensitive culturally. We'll move to a more industrial place. We bombed Hiroshima, and everybody thought, nope, America, that did their one bomb, that's it, that's all they have. But we called for an absolute total surrender. And it took them several days, and then we dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki, and then we got the total surrender we were looking for. In which the Emperor of Japan had to sign in the treaty that he was not a direct relation to God. It's got to be weird signing away the fact that you're a deity in the peace treaty. Strange, huh? Okay, and here is a look at an important building before and after the atomic blast. And there's a cathedral. And the world was at peace for a couple of years. And then because of the Cold War, we were in the Korean War very quickly thereafter. And that's tomorrow's lecture.